Pleasanton, California, summer break is just a few weeks away. To avoid bullies, 14-year-old Tina Fales skips the school bus. She takes her usual neighborhood shortcut home. But this time, she never makes it.
I remember every bit of that day like it was yesterday. I came home from school and my sister wasn't there. On a typical day, she would get home before me, watch over me, and she'd help me with my homework. There'd be times where my mom would go out at night and my sister would put me to bed. She protected me, she looked out for me all the time. Another hour passed by and she still hadn't come home. I remember riding my bike out in the court. I remember an undercover police car that came down the street. Right away I knew something was up. I just felt like it was going to stop at our house. I was scared. I didn't know what was going on. It was the next day that I found out from my parents what had happened. That my sister was killed.
A truck driver's driving through Pleasanton on the freeway looked over to his right and saw what he felt was a person in distress or possibly harmed. He starts walking down the drainage culvert. He sees blood and realizes there's a dead body down in the creek.
I was in my office when I learned of the homicide. I always dreaded getting a notification call like that. Somebody killed a little girl. Nothing like that ever happened to such a young person in Pleasanton's history. It was a very cold crime scene. There's no weapon. There's no fingerprints, there's no footprints. Officers noticed a purse suspended in a tree above the body. They found a report card that had the name Tina Fales on it. Freshman at Foothill High School. Tina had a lot of trauma done to her body in the attack. She was stabbed 44 times.
The coroner determined the first 38 times she's stabbed, she's still alive. Some of her wounds were up to 5 inches deep.
Another thing that was noted by the coroner was that there was probably no hilt or guard on the knife because there was no marks or indentations on the body. At some point, we felt that in the course of stabbing Tina, the suspect's hand would slide off of the handle because there's no protective guard onto the blade and actually cut themselves.
It would make sense in my mind that someone of a psychopathic nature would be responsible for her death. It was just so vicious and so rageful.
At the time of the murder, I'm 20 years old. I'm a member of the Pleasanton Police Department Explorer Post. I am asked to set up a grid search looking for the murder weapon. Here I'm walking through a field and I'm thinking about a girl just a few years younger than me that was stabbed to death. This is Pleasanton, where it's safe to leave your doors unlocked. It's safe to leave your windows open. And suddenly, the innocence is kind of taken from the community. We weren't able to find the murder weapon.
There was very little to go on, so we had to rely on talking to people. Who in the hell killed a little girl alone in front of a culvert?
Detectives go up to Foothill High School and they start interviewing students looking for leads to follow up on. Witnesses that may have seen Tina that day, witnesses that may have information on the killer's motive for killing her. They find out that Tina was being bullied at school. She used to ride the bus home, but several girls on the bus were picking on her. They were threatening to beat her up.
Tina could no longer ride the bus. She had to go through the culvert. This culvert was, in essence, a shortcut between Foothill High School and home. It was like a swamp. It felt spooky. The tunnel itself seemed like crossing into another dimension. It was dark. Once you got halfway, you couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. You could hear the cars and the trucks on the freeway roaring overhead. You're isolated. You're all alone. If you were to scream for help, no one would be able to hear you.
The day Tina was murdered, the girls that taunted Tina had thrown rocks at her.
I think that day one of them had said, "Hey, let's tie Tina to a tree and stab her." It was petrifying.
These girls were questioned. They did share that they didn't like her for whatever reason. But that particular day, the girls were actually in detention. So it wasn't possible for them to have been involved in killing Tina. We're trying to identify witnesses that may lead us to the killer.
Shortly before 3 p.m., 2 students were riding in a car. Steve Carlson and Todd Smith. Carlson remarked, "Look, there's Tina Fales," as she was headed toward the culvert.
Steve sees a male student named Jeff Michelson running through the drainage culvert that goes under I-680 right around 3 o'clock or 3:05 at the time of the murder. Jeff Michelson becomes one of the first big suspects in the case. At the same time, while investigators at the school are speaking to students, there's another group of detectives that are at Tina's house speaking with her family.
Detectives turn to the family and family friends because they're the closest people to the victim. And usually, somebody close has committed the crime.
Investigators find out that Tina's mom, Shirley, has a boyfriend who has recently moved out. His name is Keith Fitzwater. Keith moved out of the Fales residence because he was creating some family tension in the house.
I didn't care for Keith much at all. He was 15 years younger than my mom. He was in his early 20s at the time. He had a pretty bad temper.
He started drinking heavily. He had been violent toward Shirley.
A few days prior to my sister being murdered, my sister started yelling at him to leave my mom alone. It made me feel like it could be Keith.
Keith Fitzwater, the person close to the victim, and Jeff Michelson, a young man that had been seen in close proximity to the crime scene at the time of the homicide. We have two possible suspects in Tina's murder. The young girl's murdered in a vicious attack. We have two possible suspects, Keith Fitzwater and Jeff Michelson.
Which one of these guys is responsible for this killing? When detectives look into Jeff Michelson, they find out that he was known as the bully that picked on other smaller kids. According to eyewitnesses, on the day of Tina's murder, a kid named Steve Carlson was taken by Jeff and thrown into a dumpster. And they locked him in there for about 10 minutes before a teacher came and let him out. And then later, Steve Carlson sees Jeff in the general vicinity of the crime scene at the time of Tina's murder. One of the other things that detectives found is Jeff had several instances where he had approached girls and grabbed them or groped them. But the most interesting piece was Jeff carried a hunting-style knife in a sheath that he wore sometimes on his belt. Investigators went to interview him, and they noticed that he had a cut on his index finger.
The reason the cut was significant was the possibility that the killer cut himself. When questioned as to how he got the cut, Jeff gave two different versions of the story.
He said he was at work and he was walking with a pan and he slipped, and when he dropped the pan, he cut himself. When they asked him about it again later, he said that he was replacing a vent hood. When they asked him if he had advised his boss that he'd cut himself, he said, "No, I didn't think it was a big deal, so I didn't tell him about it."
Because of the conflicting statements that Jeff made, officers got a search warrant and went to his house. They found two hunting knives. The hunting knives were sent to the crime lab. They were examined for traces of blood. And they were found to be clean. Why he told the two stories, we don't know. I was telling myself there was so much there, but there was not enough to file a case on. We had to move on because he wasn't the only suspect in our case.
Investigators continued to look at Keith Fitzwater, Tina's mom's boyfriend. He had a violent temper.
He was physically, verbally abusive. The only time he was ever nice was the night when Tina died. You know, it was unbelievably nice that it almost seems suspicious.
Detectives meet with Keith Fitzwater, and they ask him where he was the day of the murder. He tells them that he had been at work.
Keith asked his boss if he could get a ride from him to Shirley's house because Tina had been stabbed to death.
Detectives spoke with his boss. The one thing that they find out is that Keith had a knife on his belt at the time, which he removed and asked his boss to hold on to it.
He says, "Why do you want me to keep it?" And Keith said, "I don't want to go in the house with a knife." This certainly was suspicious behavior. You had to think something was going on. Somebody that killed a little girl is still at large, but we have the potential suspect. Keith Fitzwater, hearing that Keith asked his boss to keep his knife, piqued our interest. We retrieved the knife and sent it for analysis. It came back with no trace of blood.
I don't know if Shirley ever thought Keith killed Tina, but I know that I did and other family members did.
I always had that feeling, even many years later, I always felt like it could be Keith.
With the information we had, we couldn't charge Fitzwater with Tina's murder, at least not at that time. Three weeks after Tina's murder, investigators got what looked like a very good break in the case. A man by the name of Walter Nyman sexually assaulted a young woman in Felton, California.
Walter was on a bridge, and a 17-year-old girl was walking home from school.
The fact that it was a young girl that he accosted, that it was near water, as it was like a duplicate of the crime.
She was able to flee and get away.
Walter Nyman was arrested in Felton for attempted rape and assault. What made this even more tantalizing to us was the fact that at the time of Tina's murder, Nyman lived in Pleasanton. Nyman's grandmother was contacted as she was somewhat close to him. When questioned about Tina's murder, she said, "Oh yes, April 5th. I remember the date very specifically because that was the day that Walter showed up at my house."
When he showed up at his grandmother's house, he seemed to be flustered and really kind of out of sort.
On the day of Tina's murder, he told his grandmother that he wanted to get out of Pleasanton. It made him a very likely suspect in our case. Police served a search warrant at his home. They were astounded at what they found. 2 bloody knives and bloody clothing.
Those items were tested for Tina's blood.
It was an adrenaline-pumping moment to believe that we had succeeded in finding Tina's killer.
It was determined that the blood on the knives, as well as the clothing, was actually animal blood. Another disappointing outcome. He still could be the killer, but there wasn't enough to proceed on the investigation. It's very, very saddening and frustrating for an investigator. We had several suspects, but there was no evidence that would prove who was responsible for killing Tina.
I didn't know why it happened to my sister. I was afraid of being killed next. I had a kid joke with me at one point saying he's one that killed my sister with a machete. I was just in shock. If I would hear things in my backyard, I would call the police. I didn't really have anyone to fill the void after my sister passed. My mom did what she could, but she started breaking down mentally. She was in constant dismay, just wanting to know what happened.
My estimation is she was struggling for her sanity over the loss of her daughter. If she had what she thought was new information or something that needed to be looked into, she would tell us.
Shirley was reading a newspaper article. She saw a picture of Michael Ide.
This guy in prison up in Washington State used to live in Pleasanton. He had been identified as having killed a young lady around the time of Tina's murder.
Shirley looked at the photo in the newspaper and went, "Oh my gosh, this guy looks really familiar." She believed that she had a photograph of herself and Michael Ide from an occasion where they had met at a barbecue.
And she looks at it and says, "My gosh, dead ringer." Shirley came into the department with a picture of Michael Ide.
My mom said there could be some closure coming. I thought we found the killer. This thing would finally be solved.
The lead investigator sent detectives up to Washington to interview the people that had introduced Shirley to the man she had a picture taken with. They said, "That's not Michael Ide." More disappointment stacked on top of disappointment. We had to move on again. I retired from the police force in January of 2000. When you've worked on something as long and as hard as the department did on that case, it is disappointing. Justice is supposed to prevail. The good guys win. The bad guys are supposed to lose.
Leads run out, and the investigation shuts down. The case is cold. Life for the Fales family stands still.
I just felt so sorry for Shirley. After that, she just couldn't function anymore.
As the case gets older and older, she slowly started deteriorating just mentally.
She started just eliminating friend after friend.
She would always have her house spotless. Then whenever she'd have these breakdowns, she wouldn't clean the dishes for months. I'm seeing her deteriorate, just go crazy right in front of me. I'd have to call the crisis unit around the time I was about 18 years old in order to get her put into mental hospitals.
I would be so mad when I would think of whoever killed Tina. They didn't just take Tina from us. He took Shirley because she had no life after that.
When I was pregnant with my second child, Zachary, I was on limited duty. I have no suspect contact. As a pregnant police detective, you just have more time on your hands. So I wanted to look into the unsolved murders, and that's when I picked up Tina Fales' murder case. It was overwhelming, to say the least. 20,000 pages worth of statements and notes. One of the first things that I did was I viewed the crime scene photos. This scene was just horrific. What she went through the last moments of her life, it's unacceptable to me. In working with cold cases, the victims are never forgotten. I've worked my whole life to prepare myself for a case such as this. People who get into law enforcement don't do it for the money. We do it to help people. I want to provide closure to Tina and to her family. I just knew that I had to find who had done this. Once I'm reading through the investigation, what really stood out to me was there were so many suspects that were close to Tina. However, what really stood out to me were the serial killings that were happening in the area at the time. In the 80s, there were 3 serial killers identified as murdering young girls in the Pleasanton area. One of them has to be the person responsible for Tina's death. In November of 1984, Lisa Monzo is found murdered, and it's determined that Michael Ide was responsible for her killing. In December of 1983, Kelly Poppleton was found murdered. It's eventually found that Robert Rhodes is the killer. In 1989, James DeVeggio and his girlfriend, Michelle Machad, kidnapped Vanessa Sampson off the street in Pleasanton. They had fashioned a sexual torture chamber in the back of his van, and they had Vanessa tied up. They sexually assaulted her several times before driving her to the area of Tahoe, where they eventually strangled her and left her in a snowbank. Tina fit their profile, young Caucasian girls in the same area. What really surprised me was that James DeVeggio went to Foothill High School. At the time of Tina's murder, James would disappear for days on end with no explanation of where he had been. He knew that same shortcut through the culvert. This puts James in the area at the time of Tina's murder. I wanted to go interview James DeVeggio in prison, but I just couldn't have that suspect contact due to the fact I was pregnant. So I had to hand some things off to other detectives. Lieutenant Davis interviews James DeVeggio. DeVeggio levels and says, "Look, I'm in prison for the rest of my life. I've got nothing to lose. If I was involved in Tina's murder, I would tell you I'm not involved." He actually points the finger at Walter Nyman. Walter Nyman was on the suspect list days after Tina's murder because of kidnapping and sexual assault, but they couldn't confirm or deny that he was ever involved. James DeVeggio and Walter Nyman are friends.
They used to drink together at the Pastime Bar. You couldn't walk into the place without smelling urine. It was that bad. To have 2 people of that ilk together in one place You have to wonder what they might have done together.
One of them has to be the person responsible for Tina's death. What I really needed was evidence. Where do we have the best chance of finding something that maybe was overlooked before? All you have to go on are these crime scene photographs. And that's how you recreate the scene in your mind. From the coroner's report, I know there's no guard on the killer's knife, so the murderer's hand might have slipped down. It's very possible that he cut himself, leaving some kind of evidence somewhere. And I have to figure out, okay, what would he have touched? When I'm looking at the evidence photos, there is a purse hanging from the branches of a tree. Seeing the purse up in the tree just didn't make sense to me at all. I think Tina would try and hold on to her purse and possibly try and fight back with it, using it as a weapon. This was kind of an aha moment for me. It just really clicked that probably the last person to touch this purse was the suspect. Over the years, as DNA technology had advanced, Tina's sweatshirt had been submitted many times, but her purse had only been looked at for fingerprints. When I saw the purse wrapped in the evidence bag, I see the purse is textured. The purse's material just wasn't conducive for fingerprinting. Even though I couldn't see anything on the purse, I still felt that it was the best evidence that we had. I handed it over through the chain of evidence to the FBI in Quantico, Virginia. At this point in an investigation, I had interviewed as many people as I could, and in regards to the serial killers, I had researched them and looked into them as much as I possibly could. We had narrowed down the suspects to either Walter Nyman or James DeVeggio. What I really needed was that evidence to come back, and I was hoping for a DNA match, putting either one of them at the scene. One day I get a work call, and it's the FBI. The FBI agent says to me, "Do you want to know who killed Tina Fales?" I can't believe I'm getting this call finally. Obviously, they have a hit. The FBI found 4 drops of the suspect's blood on the purse. This solidified the theory that had gone back for decades, that the murderer's hand had slid down on the knife, possibly cutting himself. At this point, I felt as confident as I could that the killer was James DeVeggio or Walter Nyman. I say, yeah, well, I want to know who. I wasn't ready for what I discovered. In my mind, I'm mostly expecting the FBI to say James DeVeggio or Walter Nyman. The FBI agent says it's Steve Carlson, the student who was locked in the dumpster. Later, after Tina's body was found, Steve was the first witness officers spoke with.
He told them that he saw a male student named Jeff Michelson in the general vicinity of the crime scene on that particular day.
He was trying to push investigators toward another suspect.
Steve was 16. Tina was 14. I just couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that a kid could kill a kid. It's just so heinous. You don't want to believe it.
Okay, now we have the suspect. Let's go back, take a look at the evidence, and try to piece things together. After going back and interviewing some of the other witnesses regarding what they remembered about that day, we know that Steve's parents left him alone in the house. Steve went to the school and invited other students to come over to his house and drink and use drugs. Nobody wanted to go.
And then later, some kids lock him in the dumpster. And when Steve gets out, he is covered in garbage and food, and he is pissed off.
So at that point, Steve returned home to his house and got into his mom's car and started driving around the neighborhood. When investigators spoke to Steve, he said that he was with Todd Smith, but Todd later says, "I never said that I was with him." Steve also told detectives he had seen Tina walking to the culvert.
Steve tells them that Tina gives him a dirty look, like, "Why are you speeding through the neighborhood?"
We believe that Steve got upset and at that point decided to follow Tina down into that creek.
My gut was telling me that putting that purse into the tree was a deliberate act. He was marking the scene so he could either go back later or watch police as they worked.
Steve's residence had a clear view of the culvert where Tina was killed. According to eyewitnesses, after the body is discovered, Steve Carlson is seen on the roof of his home watching as police begin their investigation. In 2011, Steve Carlson was actually incarcerated on an unrelated drug charge. He had been arrested over the years for numerous drug violations. He had been arrested up in the Sacramento area for a sexual assault on a young girl up there. Steve was nothing like the 16-year-old boy that had attended Foothill High School. Early photos showed him with blonde hair, kind of a good-looking kid. Now he was covered with tattoos, just a very hard individual.
We're looking into a homicide that occurred in Pleasanton in 1984 in high school. Do you remember that? You were in high school. Tina Fales got killed. Do you remember that? Yeah. We're recontacting old cases from that case, and we... Oh, yeah. There you go.
Steve became violently ill. About 2 weeks after we interviewed him, Steve was due to be released on his unrelated drug offense. Detective Pat and I went down. We met with deputies ahead of time and told them that we were going to place Steve under arrest for murder.
Steve, you're under arrest for the murder of Tina Fales.
In 1984, I was there looking for the murder weapon, and I got to put the handcuffs on him. That was such a special feeling. Once we booked Stephen at Santa Rita Jail, I went over to Shirley Fales' residence. She asked, "Did you find him?" It was like she knew. She agonized over Tina's death for 27 years. It affected her health. It affected her mental well-being. It certainly took a big portion of her life from her.
the Pleasanton police can finally put the 30-year case to rest, hopefully giving the Fales family a chance to move on. But for Tina's mom, justice didn't come soon enough.
On the day prior to the trial, my mom had a massive heart attack.
I think she just couldn't go through the trial and died of a broken heart.
A year after my sister's murder, my mom wrote a poem. And she wrote the poem to my sister. And it's called I Had a Dream. I had a dream.
I had a dream. It was a beautiful dream.
It was a fantasy come true. Tina came home. We were all home again.
They laughed and cried, and soon the teasing I missed began. But soon Tina had to leave.
Someday, we'll all be together again. I miss the family I had, and I wish at that time I knew how lucky I was. But the dream ended long ago, and her last words were, "Bye, Mom."
There is a specific kind of tranquility that belongs exclusively to the remote islands of the South Pacific, a profound stillness that cannot be found in the sprawling concrete landscapes of the mainland United States. American Samoa, an unincorporated territory nestled deep in the vast expanse of the ocean, is a place where the concept of community is not merely a social construct, but a vital, breathing entity. In a territory where the population is small and deeply interconnected, anonymity is a luxury that simply does not exist. Everyone is known to someone else, bound by blood, by marriage, or by the shared experience of living in a beautiful but isolated paradise. For generations, this deep interconnectedness fostered an environment of relative safety and profound mutual respect. Crimes of extreme, calculated violence, particularly involving firearms and public spaces, were considered alien concepts, terrifying anomalies that belonged to the distant shores of other nations, not to the quiet streets of Fagatogo. This inherent belief in the protective embrace of the community shaped everything on the island, including the very foundation of its law enforcement. The justice system and the police force in American Samoa operated under a philosophy that reflected this deep-seated trust in societal bonds. It was a philosophy built on the assumption that authority was respected not because of the threat of lethal force, but because of the moral and communal weight of the badge itself. Because of this deeply ingrained cultural perspective, the laws of the territory dictated a reality that would be unthinkable in almost any modern jurisdiction across the globe. Ordinary police officers on duty, the men and women tasked with maintaining order, responding to crises, and protecting the public, were not permitted to carry firearms. They walked the streets, patrolled the neighborhoods, and guarded the institutions of justice armed with nothing more than their uniforms, their training, and an unspoken covenant of peace with the citizens they served. It was a system that relied entirely on the assumption of basic human decency and the deterring power of communal shame. But systems built on the assumption of peace are tragically vulnerable when confronted with an individual who has chosen to entirely discard the social contract. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown was a man who understood the intricacies of this island community better than most. At 44 years old, he was not merely an officer of the law. He was a seasoned veteran, a deeply respected detective who had dedicated 19 years of his life to the police force. 19 years in a place like American Samoa means navigating an endless web of complex familial relationships, handling delicate situations with tact, and serving as a steady, reliable pillar in times of crisis. He was a man who had seen the subtle shifts in the island's undercurrents, the quiet disputes that flared and faded, and the steady rhythm of island justice. Beyond the uniform, he was a devoted father to 2 children and a loving husband, anchoring his life not just in duty, but in the profound responsibilities of family. Every day he put on his uniform, he stepped out into the world with the implicit understanding that his safety depended on the respect of the people he encountered. He was a protector who, by the very design of the system he served, was left entirely unprotected against the ultimate form of malice. The morning of July 22, 2010, began like any other typical day in the administrative heart of the territory. The village of Fagatogo, serving as the seat of government, was bustling with the quiet, orderly movement of civil servants, legal professionals, and ordinary citizens. At the center of this daily routine was the temporary building housing the High Court of American Samoa, situated in the Malaloa area. The atmosphere around a courthouse is always laden with a specific kind of tension, an invisible weight generated by the high stakes of the proceedings inside. On this particular morning, the court had convened to hear a case involving charges of assault and weapons possession. The defendant in this case was a family relative of a man named Siamo Jr. Inside the courtroom, the wheels of justice turned and ultimately arrived at a conclusion that favored the defense. The relative was formally acquitted of all the charges against him. In the eyes of the law, the matter was settled, the slate was wiped clean, and the individuals involved were free to walk out of the building and resume their lives. However, the sterile resolutions of a courtroom rarely extinguish the burning embers of deeply personal conflicts. While the legal proceedings had reached their terminus, an entirely different narrative, fueled by an intense and long-standing personal vendetta, was silently moving toward a horrific climax just outside the doors. Lieutenant Brown was stationed outside the courthouse that morning, tasked with the routine but essential duty of providing security perimeter for the judicial proceedings. His presence was meant to be a symbol of order, a reassuring figure ensuring that the heightened emotions often accompanying court decisions did not spill over into public disruption. As the doors of the courthouse opened and the attendees began to file out into the tropical morning air, the atmosphere should have been one of relief, or at least the quiet dispersal of an concluded event. Instead, the invisible tension began to rapidly condense around one specific individual who had been waiting for this exact moment. Siamo Jr. was not a stranger to Lieutenant Brown. In a community where lives constantly intersect, their paths had crossed, and those intersections had bred a profound and poisonous animosity. This was not a random encounter. It was not a crime of opportunity born from a sudden loss of control. It was the culmination of a deep-seated personal conflict, a dark grudge that had been allowed to fester and grow in the hidden corners of Siamo's mind. The acquittal of his relative was merely the backdrop, the setting of the stage for a confrontation he had actively anticipated. As he emerged from the vicinity of the court, his focus was entirely locked onto the veteran officer standing guard. The distance between the routine safety of an ordinary morning and an irreversible tragedy is often measured in just a few agonizingly normal steps. Siamo began to walk deliberately toward Lieutenant Brown. The officer, recognizing the man and likely aware of the historical friction between them, would have had only seconds to assess the situation. In those crucial moments, there was no immediate visual cue of the lethal danger approaching. Siamo did not arrive shouting or brandishing a weapon in plain sight. He closed the distance with a chilling, focused calm, masking the violent intent that was about to shatter the history of the island. When Siamo was only a few paces away from the unprotected officer, he initiated the encounter with a seemingly mundane, albeit aggressive, verbal demand. He addressed Lieutenant Brown directly, demanding an opportunity to speak with him. To an outside observer, it might have looked like the beginning of an intense argument, a heated exchange between two men with bad blood settling a dispute in the shadow of the courthouse. But the demand for a conversation was nothing more than a tactical delay, a cruel misdirection designed to freeze the officer in place, to capture his attention entirely for the fraction of a second needed to execute the true objective. Lieutenant Brown, unarmed and bound by his duty to de-escalate and manage conflict, stood his ground. He faced a man who harbored a lethal hatred for him, completely unaware that the very system he had dedicated nearly 2 decades of his life to uphold had stripped him of the only tool that could have saved his life. He was entirely reliant on his authority, his experience, and the hope that the confrontation would remain purely verbal. He was looking into the eyes of a man who had already made the conscious decision to commit murder in broad daylight, in the most public of spaces, surrounded by witnesses, law enforcement peers, and the very symbols of justice. The air around the courthouse, heavy with the morning humidity, seemed to hold its breath. The reporters chatting near the steps, the court clerks carrying files, the citizens relieved by the recent verdict, were all entirely oblivious to the fact that they were standing on the precipice of a historical trauma. They were about to witness an act of brutality so shocking and so severe that it would force the entire territory to fundamentally reevaluate its identity, its laws, and its naive trust in the protective power of its isolation. The deep, personal conflict that had remained hidden beneath the surface of island life was about to violently erupt, tearing away the illusion of absolute safety and demanding a devastating toll in blood. As the final words of Siamo's demand hung in the air, the facade of a peaceful conversation instantly vanished, giving way to the cold, calculated mechanics of an execution. The fraction of a second that separates absolute normalcy from irreversible tragedy is almost impossible to perceive until it has already passed. For the dozens of people standing outside the High Court in Malaloa that morning, the scene was entirely unremarkable, completely devoid of any warning signs that the fabric of their reality was about to be violently torn apart. The sun beat down on the pavement, reporters casually reviewed their notes, and court employees stepped out to catch a breath of the humid Pacific air. The conversation between the man in civilian clothes and the uniformed police lieutenant appeared, from a distance, to be nothing more than an intense but manageable interaction. There was no visible struggle, no dramatic physical altercation that might have drawn the immediate, panicked attention of the crowd. Instead, there was a chilling, focused intimacy to the encounter. The perpetrator had closed the distance deliberately, invading the personal space of the seasoned detective, manipulating the social expectation of a conversation to trap his victim in a fatal proximity. In the mind of the shooter, the bustling courthouse steps, the witnesses, and the bright morning light were entirely irrelevant. His reality had narrowed down to a single, horrific objective, driven by a deeply personal animosity that had completely severed his connection to human empathy. The sudden escalation of the event did not begin with a shout or a wide, sweeping movement. It began with an action so subtle, so terrifyingly concealed, that it bypassed all the natural defensive instincts of the highly trained officer standing before him. As the demand for a conversation still hung in the heavy air, the perpetrator abruptly shattered the illusion of dialogue. He reached deliberately toward his own body, slipping his hand beneath his arm. Hidden there, obscured from the view of the surrounding public and the officer himself, was a small bag, carefully positioned for immediate access. It was a calculated method of concealment, proving that this was not a spontaneous outburst of anger, but a premeditated strike, meticulously planned to ensure maximum surprise. When his hand emerged from the concealed pouch, it was gripping a handgun, bringing an instrument of lethal violence into a space explicitly dedicated to the peaceful resolution of conflict. The sight of a firearm in that specific environment, a place where even the police officers relied entirely on the authority of their uniform rather than the threat of a weapon, was a profound visual shock. It was an anomaly so severe that the human brain struggles to process it in real time. The first gunshot tore through the morning air with a deafening, unnatural violence. The sharp, concussive crack of the weapon did not just break the silence, it shattered the fundamental sense of security that defined the island community. At point-blank range, there was absolutely no opportunity for evasion, no chance for the veteran detective to utilize his 19 years of law enforcement experience. The bullet struck the lieutenant with devastating force, the physical impact violently disrupting the stillness of the standoff. For the officer, a man who had dedicated nearly 2 decades of his life to protecting the citizens of this territory, the betrayal of the situation was absolute. He had stood his ground, adhering to the principles of his unarmed duty, facing a man he knew, only to be met with a cowardly and lethal ambush. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact forced his body to yield, gravity taking hold as the life-altering trauma instantly overwhelmed his physical form. He collapsed onto the hard concrete outside the very institution of justice he had sworn to protect, struck down in the prime of his life and his career, entirely defenseless against a deeply personal and monstrously violent vendetta. What occurred in the immediate aftermath of that first, fatal strike elevated the crime from a horrific ambush to an act of unspeakable, cold-blooded execution. In many chaotic situations involving firearms, an initial shot is followed by panic, flight, or a frantic assessment of the environment by the shooter. But the perpetrator outside the high court exhibited a terrifying lack of urgency, a chilling calmness that bespoke a total absence of remorse. As the lieutenant lay gravely wounded and incapacitated on the ground, the shooter did not retreat. He did not look around to gauge the reaction of the stunned crowd or seek an immediate avenue of escape. Instead, he took deliberate, measured steps forward, closing the final, agonizing distance between himself and the fallen officer. He positioned himself directly over the body of the man he had just shot, standing above him with an absolute and merciless dominance. This was not merely about incapacitating an opponent, it was about ensuring absolute destruction. With the officer helpless beneath him, the perpetrator aimed his weapon downward and fired 2 additional, deliberate shots directly into the victim. These were not panicked, random discharges, but calculated, finishing strikes executed with the sole intention of extinguishing any faint possibility of survival. The psychological impact of witnessing such an intensely intimate and brutal execution in broad daylight was catastrophic for the bystanders. The immediate area around the courthouse was populated by court clerks, administrative staff, local journalists, and ordinary citizens who had been casually observing the morning routine. For a terrifying second, time seemed to suspend itself. The human mind, confronted with an act of violence so extreme and so out of context with its surroundings, often freezes, attempting to reconcile the horrifying visual data with the expected reality of a peaceful island morning. The sharp smell of burnt gunpowder rapidly mixed with the salty ocean air, providing a grotesque sensory confirmation of the nightmare unfolding before them. Then, the paralysis broke, replaced by a chaotic wave of pure, unadulterated terror. People began to scream, their voices echoing off the concrete walls of the government buildings. The orderly dispersal of the courtroom attendees instantly dissolved into a frantic, desperate scramble for survival. Individuals dove behind parked vehicles, flattened themselves against the unforgiving stone walls of the courthouse, or simply ran blindly in any direction that offered the illusion of distance from the unrelenting violence. The safe haven of the Judicial Center had been transformed in a matter of seconds into an active kill zone, deeply scarring the collective psyche of the community. The violent sequence, however, had not yet reached its conclusion. The deafening sound of the execution drew the immediate, desperate attention of the other law enforcement personnel scattered around the perimeter. These officers, colleagues, and friends of the fallen lieutenant were thrust into a truly nightmarish scenario. Their deepest instincts, forged by training and an innate sense of duty, commanded them to rush toward the danger, to neutralize the threat and protect the innocent lives scrambling around them. Yet, they were trapped in the terrifying paradox of their own legal system. They were running toward an active, merciless shooter while entirely devoid of the lethal force necessary to stop him. They were armed only with their courage, attempting to maneuver into positions where they might somehow intervene, distract, or physically overpower a man who had just demonstrated a total willingness to kill. As these brave individuals moved to respond, the perpetrator instantly recognized the shifting dynamic. He was no longer dealing with a single, isolated target. Having ensured the death of his primary victim, he pivoted, his focus snapping toward the incoming officers. The cold calculation that had defined the initial assassination remained entirely intact. He did not hesitate. Raising the firearm once again, he aimed toward the very men attempting to restore order and pulled the trigger, unleashing a new volley of gunfire across the chaotic plaza. The arriving officers, acutely aware of their extreme vulnerability, were forced into a desperate scramble for whatever cover the open space could provide. They were diving behind architectural pillars and vehicles, trying to visually track the shooter while simultaneously attempting to avoid the lethal projectiles tearing through the air. The physical reality of the situation was desperately grim. They were attempting to suppress a heavily armed assailant using only their physical presence and whatever improvised tactics they could deploy under extreme duress. During this frantic and deeply unequal engagement, the shooter's aggressive barrage found its mark. The bullets ripped through the space, striking two of the responding officers as they desperately maneuvered to secure a tactical advantage or find safe harbor. The impact of the rounds sent a new shockwave of horror through the responding ranks. The sight of their colleagues falling, bleeding on the pavement just yards away from the lifeless body of their commanding lieutenant, was a devastating blow to the already overwhelmed police force. Yet, even in the face of this overwhelming, asymmetrical violence, the resolve of the authorities present did not break. The injuries sustained by the two officers only amplified the desperate urgency of the situation. There was no tactical retreat available, no heavily armed response team waiting in the wings to seamlessly take control of the environment. The responsibility to end the bloodshed fell entirely on the unarmed individuals already trapped within the nightmare. The culmination of the violent event was as chaotic as its inception was calculated. The realization that the shooter was actively hunting the remaining officers triggered a massive, uncoordinated, but intensely courageous physical response from the surrounding personnel. It was a frantic, desperate convergence of humanity against an armed threat. Court-martials, judicial staff, and the remaining uninjured police officers, driven by a raw combination of adrenaline, grief, and the absolute necessity of survival, abandoned their cover. They rushed the perpetrator, effectively swarming him in a chaotic melee of bodies. The confrontation devolved into a brutal, close-quarters physical struggle on the sun-baked pavement. Hands grasped desperately at the weapon, fighting to wrench the firearm away from the man who had already caused so much devastation. The struggle was intense and fraught with the constant, terrifying possibility of the weapon discharging again into the tangled mass of people. But the sheer numerical superiority and the desperate, raw force of the responding officers eventually overwhelmed the assailant. The weapon was violently stripped from his grip, rendering him finally and forcefully neutralized. Pinned to the ground, surrounded by the bleeding bodies of the men he had shot and the enraged faces of those who had subdued him, the perpetrator was aggressively restrained and hauled away, leaving behind a plaza permanently stained by an unprecedented and unimaginable tragedy. When the deafening echoes of the gunfire finally ceased bouncing off the concrete walls of the government buildings in Fagatogo, an agonizing and heavy silence rushed in to take their place. The immediate physical threat had been violently neutralized by the desperate, bare-handed bravery of the surviving personnel, but the damage inflicted in those few chaotic minutes was permanent and devastating. The plaza outside the temporary High Court, normally a mundane space of legal transit and quiet conversation, had been irrevocably transformed into a chaotic trauma scene. Paramedics and emergency responders rushed into the area, their equipment clattering against the sun-baked pavement, but for the veteran detective lying at the center of the violence, their frantic medical efforts were tragically futile. The severe, point-blank trauma he had sustained during the calculated execution was absolute and irreversible. The community of American Samoa, characterized by its deep interconnectedness and relative geographic isolation from the mainland United States, was abruptly forced to confront a level of brazen, lethal violence that had previously felt oceans away. As the news of the assassination began to ripple outward from the capital, moving through the tight-knit villages and families across the island, it carried with it a profound sense of collective trauma. This was not merely the tragic loss of a dedicated public servant. It was the violent shattering of a foundational illusion that the island's inherent cultural respect could serve as an impenetrable shield against the extreme malice of the modern world. As the initial wave of shock began to give way to a desperate search for comprehension, a glaring, systemic vulnerability was violently dragged into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The brutal reality of the ambush exposed a terrifying paradox at the very heart of the territory's law enforcement infrastructure. In the year 2010, the legal framework governing the police force in American Samoa operated under a deeply traditional, yet ultimately fatal, legislative mandate. Ordinary police officers, the brave men and women tasked with actively confronting danger and securing the public peace, were strictly prohibited by law from carrying firearms while executing their daily duties. This policy was not born of administrative negligence, but rather from a deeply ingrained cultural philosophy that prioritized community policing, mutual respect, and peaceful conflict resolution over the looming threat of lethal force. It was a system built entirely on the fragile assumption that the authority of the police uniform, combined with the inherent social bonds of the Samoan way of life, would be entirely sufficient to deter extreme acts of violence. However, this idealistic and historically rooted framework failed catastrophically the exact moment it encountered an individual who had entirely abandoned the social contract. When the shooter approached the courthouse steps with a concealed weapon and a heart full of lethal intent, he was stepping into an environment where he held an absolute, uncontested tactical superiority over the very people tasked with stopping him. The grim implications of this unarmed mandate were horrifyingly clear in the moments leading up to the fatal encounter. The veteran detective, a man who had dedicated nearly 2 decades of his life to navigating the complex social dynamics of his community, was sent to guard a highly sensitive judicial proceeding entirely devoid of the fundamental tools required for self-defense in a worst-case scenario. He was wearing the recognized uniform of a territorial protector, yet the legislative system he faithfully served had effectively rendered him a completely defenseless target. When the concealed handgun was finally drawn by his attacker, there was absolutely no opportunity for the officer to draw a weapon of his own, no chance to level the deadly playing field, and no physical means to halt the incoming violence. His 19 years of investigative experience, his deep understanding of human behavior, and his authoritative presence were instantly nullified by the simple, brutal mechanics of a firearm deployed against an unarmed man. The agonizing realization that the officer died not just because of the malice of a deeply disturbed individual, but also because he was systemically denied the ability to fight back, added a layer of profound institutional betrayal to the already overwhelming public grief. The image of the fallen officer, completely defenseless against a merciless executioner, became a stark, undeniable symbol of a law enforcement philosophy that had tragically outlived its viability in an increasingly unpredictable and dangerous world. The outrage over this massive systemic vulnerability quickly reached the highest echelons of the island's police leadership, sparking an immediate and intensely emotional administrative response. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, as the blood of his officers still stained the pavement outside the judicial center, the police commissioner stepped forward to address the deeply shaken public and the eager media representatives. His demeanor was not characterized by the measured, carefully constructed diplomatic tones usually adopted by public officials in times of severe crisis. Instead, he radiated a palpable, visceral anger, a profound professional frustration born directly from the agonizing loss of a trusted veteran lieutenant and the grievous gunshot injuries sustained by 2 other brave officers. Without relying on measured bureaucratic language to soften the blow, he delivered a blistering, passionate indictment of the very territorial policies that had governed his department for decades. He pointed directly to the savage, unprovoked murder of the detective as the ultimate, undeniable, and deeply painful proof of a catastrophic institutional failure. He passionately argued that the brutal events of that morning completely dismantled any remaining traditional arguments for maintaining an unarmed police force. The commissioner made it unequivocally clear to the government and the public that the tragic loss of life was a painful, defining mandate for immediate legislative change, insisting with absolute conviction that the entire active police force executing warrants and guarding the territory must be equipped with firearms. His message was a desperate, urgent plea for basic survival tools, arguing that officers simply could not be expected to protect the citizens of American Samoa if they were legally prohibited from protecting themselves from heavily armed, cold-blooded aggressors. As the police department aggressively grappled with its own agonizing vulnerability and pushed for immediate reform, the focus of the territory inevitably shifted toward the judicial system and the looming fate of the man responsible for the massacre. The individual who had orchestrated and executed the daylight ambush was securely in state custody, his violent rampage permanently halted, but the legal machinery designed to process his horrific crimes was about to encounter a series of unprecedented systemic roadblocks. The extreme brutality of the crime, the clearly premeditated nature of the ambush, and the fact that it was perpetrated against an active-duty law enforcement officer right in front of a territory's highest court, demanded the most severe judicial response available under the law. The prosecution team, bearing the immense weight of representing the collective outrage and profound grief of the island community, moved aggressively to file charges that accurately reflected the sheer magnitude of the atrocity. They formally charged the perpetrator with a multitude of severe offenses, the most significant and consequential of which was first-degree murder. This was not a charge that suggested a crime of uncontrollable passion or a sudden, momentary lapse in judgment. It was an explicit, heavy legal accusation that the shooter had meticulously planned, calculated, and deliberately executed the veteran officer with absolute malice aforethought. In the eyes of the prosecution, the cold, calculated nature of the close-range execution, combined with the subsequent violent assault on the responding unarmed officers, elevated the crime far beyond the boundaries of standard punitive measures and demanded an exceptional legal strategy. Driven by the extreme severity of the charges and an overwhelming public demand for absolute, unyielding justice, the prosecuting attorneys made a monumental legal decision that would instantly plunge the remote island into a profound constitutional and logistical crisis. They officially declared their unwavering intention to seek the ultimate, irreversible punishment available under the territorial law, explicitly demanding the death penalty for the perpetrator. This aggressive decision sent an electric shockwave through the entire legal establishment, the local government, and the broader community. The pursuit of capital punishment is an inherently grave and infinitely complex endeavor in any modern jurisdiction, demanding exhaustive legal resources, meticulous procedural adherence, and agonizing moral considerations from all involved parties. But in the highly specific context of American Samoa, the demand for the death penalty represented a monumental leap into legally and practically uncharted territory. The statutes allowing for capital punishment technically existed within the territory's legal code, remaining written on the books as a dormant, dusty relic of an older, harsher era of territorial justice. However, the practical, modern application of this extreme measure was an entirely different and utterly impossible reality. The aggressive pursuit of this ultimate sentence meant suddenly awakening a legal mechanism that had been completely inactive and essentially forgotten by the government for generations, forcing the modern judicial system to grapple with a level of punitive severity it was entirely unprepared to handle. The crisis triggered by the prosecution's demand for the ultimate penalty was not merely philosophical or moral. It was a deeply practical, infrastructural, and logistical nightmare that completely paralyzed the forward momentum of the high-profile case. While the legal framework for the death penalty theoretically existed in the dusty archives of the territorial law, the government had not actually executed a prisoner in more than half a century, with the very last recorded instance of capital punishment dating all the way back to the late 1930s. Because the punishment had been practically obsolete for over 50 years, the government of American Samoa possessed absolutely none of the physical infrastructure, established legal protocols, or highly trained personnel required to actually carry out a state-sanctioned execution in the 21st century. There was no dedicated, highly secure death row facility built to house the condemned prisoner during the endless appeals process. There was no specialized execution chamber equipped for the grim task. The territory lacked a functional electric chair, and there were absolutely no regulations, specialized medical facilities, or legally procured lethal chemicals available on the island to administer a modern lethal injection. The justice system was effectively demanding a highly complex, legally fraught, and medically precise procedure in a remote jurisdiction that lacked even the most basic physical components to perform it. It was a staggering bureaucratic paradox, a situation where the strict written law demanded a final outcome that the physical and infrastructural reality of the island simply could not provide. This massive institutional void instantly transformed what should have been a straightforward, albeit highly emotional, pursuit of justice into an agonizingly slow, complicated, and incredibly expensive legal labyrinth. The defense attorneys representing the shooter were acutely aware of this monumental systemic failure and strategically utilized it to fiercely challenge the prosecution at every conceivable turn. The intense legal battles quickly moved away from the undeniable, gruesome facts of the violent ambush and instead became deeply mired in endless, highly technical arguments regarding the fundamental constitutionality of demanding a punishment that the state was physically incapable of executing. The court dockets became hopelessly clogged with complex defense motions, profound constitutional inquiries into cruel and unusual punishment, and endless, highly theoretical debates over the hypothetical logistics of an execution that could not actually take place. The profound lack of modern legal precedent meant that every single procedural step, every minor motion, had to be fiercely debated, analyzed, and ruled upon entirely from scratch, turning the High Court into an agonizingly slow theater of abstract legal theory rather than a venue for swift, decisive accountability. The clear, undeniable reality of the blood spilled on the courthouse steps was slowly being obscured by a mountain of unprecedented legal and bureaucratic complexities, marking the agonizing beginning of a grueling 6-year ordeal that would test the financial endurance of the government, the emotional resilience of the victim's grieving family, and the fundamental integrity of the territory's entire justice system. By the time the calendar finally turned to the middle of March in the year 2016, the shadow cast by the brutal daylight assassination had stretched across the island of American Samoa for nearly 6 agonizing years. The temporary High Court building in Fagatogo, the very structure where the veteran detective had taken his final, violent breaths on the sun-baked pavement, was now preparing to host the ultimate culmination of the sprawling legal nightmare. The physical scars of the attack had long since been washed away by the relentless Pacific rains, and the daily administrative rhythms of the territorial government had superficially returned to normal, but the psychological wounds inflicted upon the community remained raw and deeply sensitive. The sheer passage of time, rather than dulling the collective memory of the tragedy, had only compounded the anxiety surrounding the impending trial. For the surviving law enforcement officers who had desperately fought to subdue the heavily armed attacker, for the traumatized civilian witnesses who had watched the horrific execution unfold in broad daylight, and for the profoundly exhausted legal professionals on both sides of the aisle, the arrival of March represented a terrifying and monumental threshold. The territory was finally forcing itself to confront the grim reality of a full-scale criminal trial, an event that promised to meticulously dissect every agonizing second of the most brazen act of violence in the island's modern history. The atmosphere hanging over the capital village was thick with a palpable, suffocating tension that seemed to permeate every conversation and every quiet moment. This was not merely the commencement of a standard judicial proceeding, it was the final, desperate attempt by a deeply scarred community to extract some measure of legal accountability from an institutional system that had spent the previous 6 years paralyzed by its own logistical and constitutional inadequacies. As the formal trial proceedings officially commenced, the judicial system immediately collided with an insurmountable sociological barrier that is entirely unique to small, highly interconnected island territories. The fundamental constitutional right of any defendant facing severe criminal charges is the guarantee of a fair and impartial trial determined by an objective jury of their peers. In a sprawling mainland jurisdiction, finding 12 individuals who possess absolutely no prior knowledge of a specific crime is a routine administrative task easily accomplished within a few days. However, in the tightly knit, Insular Society of American Samoa, this constitutional requirement instantly transformed into an impossible logistical paradox. The court administration aggressively issued summonses to nearly 300 prospective jurors, an extraordinarily large pool designed to cast the widest possible net across the local population in a desperate bid to find untainted perspectives. Yet, as the exhaustive process of jury selection slowly unfolded within the tense confines of the courtroom, the stark reality of the island's demographics became glaringly apparent. The assassination of the veteran lieutenant was not an obscure or easily ignored event. It was the most heavily publicized, intensely scrutinized, and universally condemned tragedy to ever strike the territory. Every single individual called into the jury box carried the heavy burden of pre-existing knowledge. They had all consumed 6 years of relentless media coverage. They all intimately understood the profound grief of the victim's family, and many of them possessed direct or secondary social connections to the surviving officers, the court staff, or the perpetrator himself. Day after grueling day, the defense attorneys and the prosecuting legal team interviewed dozens of citizens, desperately searching for a single shred of genuine impartiality, only to be met with the undeniable truth that the entire island had already fundamentally formed its collective opinion. The sheer impossibility of selecting a neutral panel of 12 citizens from a pool of nearly 300 deeply traumatized and highly informed residents brought the already delayed judicial machinery to a grinding, definitive halt. The court was effectively trapped, completely unable to seat a jury capable of satisfying the rigid legal standards of objective fairness, turning the highly anticipated trial into a procedural catastrophe before the very first opening statement could even be delivered. This severe procedural gridlock during the critical phase of jury selection proved to be the ultimate breaking point for a defense strategy that had relied almost entirely on perpetual delay. For 6 long years, the perpetrator and his revolving door of legal representatives had successfully manipulated the territory's constitutional vulnerabilities, infrastructural weaknesses, and sheer bureaucratic exhaustion to avoid facing a final judgment. However, standing in the courtroom in March of 2016, confronted by the absolute impossibility of seating a jury and the looming reality of the overwhelming physical evidence waiting to be presented, the defense reached an inescapable conclusion. There was no remaining legal maneuver to employ, no procedural loophole left to exploit, and absolutely no narrative that could justify or obscure the cold-blooded execution documented by dozens of horrified eyewitnesses. The sheer weight of the inevitable, crushing defeat finally shattered the relentless obstinacy of the defense strategy. In a sudden, deeply consequential pivot that instantly altered the trajectory of the entire 6-year saga, the perpetrator and his legal counsel officially signaled their intention to surrender to the overwhelming pressure of the prosecution. Behind the heavy, closed doors of the judicial chambers, far away from the exhausted prospective jurors and the anxious public, a highly structured and definitive plea agreement was meticulously negotiated and formalized by the opposing legal teams. This was not a moment of sudden moral clarity or genuine remorse from the man who had brought so much devastation to the island. It was a cold, calculated legal capitulation driven entirely by the absolute certainty of an impending, catastrophic defeat at trial. The sprawling, infinitely complex legal battle that had effectively bankrupted the Territorial Defense Fund and paralyzed the High Court for over half a decade was suddenly collapsing inward, rapidly condensing into a single, binding document of admitted guilt that would finally circumvent the impossible hurdle of the jury selection process. When the courtroom doors finally reopened to the public and the official proceedings resumed, the exhausting theater of jury selection had been abruptly canceled, replaced by the grim, highly formalized ritual of a guilty plea. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from bureaucratic frustration to a heavy, breathless anticipation as the perpetrator was brought before the presiding judge to publicly dismantle his own defense. In accordance with the strictly negotiated terms of the plea deal, he formally and officially accepted legal responsibility for the horrific violence he had unleashed upon the courthouse plaza so many years prior. He explicitly pleaded guilty to the severe charge of second-degree murder, directly acknowledging his calculated role in the brutal, daylight assassination of the unarmed veteran police lieutenant. Furthermore, he systematically admitted his guilt to 2 separate and distinct charges of first-degree assault, taking absolute legal ownership for deliberately turning his weapon against the desperately scrambling, unarmed responding officers and inflicting severe physical trauma upon them. The sterile, highly structured legal language of the plea agreement stood in grotesque, jarring contrast to the sheer savagery of the actual crimes, yet the simple, spoken admission of guilt resonated through the solemn courtroom with the force of a physical blow. For the very first time in 6 excruciating years, the man responsible for tearing a massive hole in the fabric of the island community was finally forced to stand in the harsh light of the territorial justice system and publicly confess to the monstrous reality of his own premeditated actions, formally bringing the endless disputes over evidence and procedure to an absolute and permanent end. The intense emotional gravity of the confession hung over the gallery, providing a deeply necessary, albeit incredibly painful, foundation for the closure that the territory had been desperately seeking for over half a decade. With the plea agreement formally entered into the permanent judicial record and the undeniable facts of the massacre finally codified as absolute legal truth, the court moved swiftly to impose the ultimate consequences. The sentencing phase, devoid of any further argumentative delays or constitutional challenges, delivered a massive, unyielding punitive strike designed to ensure the permanent safety of the territory and provide a sense of finality to the surviving victims. For the brutal and calculated taking of the veteran detective's life, the presiding judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment, mandating by strict territorial law that the perpetrator must remain incarcerated for a minimum of 15 consecutive years before even being legally eligible to submit a request for parole consideration. To compound the severity of this punishment, the court simultaneously imposed 2 additional 10-year prison sentences for the violent first-degree assaults committed against the surviving law enforcement officers, ordering that these substantial punitive blocks run concurrently with the life sentence. However, the final, most crucial element of the resolution extended far beyond the simple mathematics of the prison term. Recognizing the extreme, unprecedented danger this individual posed to the fragile ecosystem of the island's penal infrastructure and the ongoing trauma his presence would inflict upon the local population, the justice system made the definitive administrative decision to permanently remove him from the territory altogether. He was officially processed under heavy security and subsequently transferred entirely out of the jurisdiction of American Samoa, flown across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean to be absorbed into the sprawling, highly secure federal prison system on the mainland United States. The heavy strike of the judicial gavel not only finalized the sentence, but effectively exiled the perpetrator from the very community he had sought to terrorize, permanently closing the doors of the courtroom on the darkest, most exhausting legal chapter in the history of the island, and ensuring he would never again walk the streets of Fagatogo. The heavy, definitive echo of the judge's final gavel strike marked the conclusion of the formal legal proceedings, but the true aftermath of the tragedy refused to be neatly filed away in the dusty archives of the High Court. In the quiet days that followed the perpetrator's permanent exile to a federal facility on the mainland, the island of American Samoa began the slow, agonizing process of looking inward, forced to reckon with the massive emotional and systemic debris left behind by 6 years of unyielding judicial warfare. The immediate feelings circulating through the villages of Fagatogo and beyond was not one of triumphant celebration, but rather a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The community had been held in a state of collective suspense for nearly a decade, constantly subjected to the painful reminders of that bloody July morning every time a new procedural delay or a fresh constitutional crisis made the front pages of the local news. The physical removal of the shooter provided a desperate, necessary relief from the immediate threat, but it could not instantly heal the profound psychological scars that had been carved into the collective consciousness of the territory. For a society that had long prided itself on its geographic isolation and its ability to maintain a peaceful, culturally unified way of life completely insulated from the chaotic violence of the modern world, the entire ordeal served as a brutal, irreversible loss of innocence. The illusion that the island could serve as a permanent sanctuary had been completely obliterated by a handful of bullets fired in broad daylight, leaving the citizens to navigate a new, unfamiliar reality where the threat of uncompromising malice was an undeniable, permanent fixture of their environment. At the very center of this lingering cloud of grief stood the empty, echoing void left by the tragic destruction of the victim's immediate family, a domestic unit that had been completely annihilated by the slow, grinding nature of the judicial system. The devastating reality that the detective's devoted wife had passed away from her aggressive illness just 2 weeks prior to the final resolution of the case remained a source of profound, collective heartbreak for the entire community. She had dedicated the final, most painful years of her fading life to attending endless, stagnant pretrial hearings, bravely enduring the agonizing sight of her husband's unrepentant killer while fighting a losing battle against her own physical mortality. Her tragic inability to witness the ultimate delivery of legal accountability added a layer of unbearable irony to the narrative, serving as a stark, painful monument to the real-world human cost of systemic institutional delay. The two surviving children, suddenly robbed of both their veteran protector father and their resilient, grieving mother, were left to navigate the wreckage of their family line entirely alone, carrying a heavy burden of trauma that no amount of judicial finality or prison mathematics could ever hope to alleviate. Their quiet, dignified survival in the face of such absolute, compounding loss became a powerful, defining symbol for the entire island, a stark reminder that while the legal system measures its success in terms of convictions and sentences, the human heart measures the cost in terms of empty chairs at the dinner table and the permanent silence of voices that can never be recovered. As the community slowly rallied around the surviving family members, the institutional framework of American Samoa was forced to engage in a monumental, highly contentious overhaul of its entire law enforcement philosophy. The bitter, public anger articulated by the police commissioner in the immediate wake of the assassination had steadily transformed into an unstoppable, legally binding movement for systemic reform. The terrifying image of the veteran lieutenant standing completely unarmed, unable to draw a defensive weapon as a cold-blooded executioner closed the distance, had permanently shattered the traditional, idealistic arguments that had governed the territory's police force for generations. The legislative bodies, recognizing that they could no longer in good conscience send their active duty personnel into increasingly volatile situations without the basic tools of survival, finally moved to dismantle the historic mandate that prohibited ordinary officers from carrying firearms. This shift was not embraced lightly or without profound cultural hesitation. Many traditional leaders and elder statesmen feared that introducing lethal weapons into the daily routine of island policing would fundamentally erode the sacred bonds of trust, mutual respect, and communal harmony that defined the Samoan way of life. Yet, the harsh, undeniable reality of the blood spilled on the steps of the High Court effectively silenced the theoretical objections, forcing the territory to accept the painful truth that its historic isolation could no longer protect its public servants from the evolving, unpredictable nature of 21st-century violence. The gradual, highly regulated arming of the territorial police force stood as a permanent, systemic monument to the ultimate sacrifice of the fallen detective, an institutional admission that the preservation of peace sometimes requires the readiness to deploy decisive, protective force. Beyond the immediate structural changes within the police department, the grueling 6-year saga left a permanent, defining imprint on the entire operational methodology of the territory's judicial infrastructure. The historic crisis surrounding the logistical impossibility of the death penalty had exposed a massive, highly embarrassing disparity between the abstract written laws of the island and its actual, practical capacity to enforce them. The territory had been forced to confront the reality that it had allowed complex, highly consequential statutes to remain on its books for half a century without ever maintaining the physical facilities, medical protocols, or specialized personnel required to execute them safely and constitutionally. The expenditure of over $250,000 from a fragile public budget simply to finance the procedural defense of a clear-cut capital case served as a harsh, unforgettable lesson in administrative preparedness, prompting future legal professionals and legislators to approach the pursuit of extreme punishments with a far greater degree of pragmatic caution. The High Court itself, having survived the unprecedented gridlock of trying to select an impartial jury from a pool of nearly 300 deeply connected residents, developed new, highly specialized administrative procedures to better manage high-profile, emotionally charged cases in the future. The memory of the paralyzing delay became a baseline metric for the local justice system, a constant warning that justice delayed is not merely justice denied, but a compounding form of secondary trauma inflicted directly upon the victims, the witnesses, and the very integrity of the law itself. Ultimately, The true legacy of the historic case does not reside within the legislative changes, the administrative reforms, or the concrete walls of the federal prison housing the exiled perpetrator. Instead, it lives on in the quiet, reflective moments of the people who continue to walk past the courthouse plaza in Fagatogo, a space that will forever hold the invisible weight of that transformative July morning. True crime narratives often focus entirely on the dark psychology of the offender or the mechanical intricacies of the investigation, but the profound lesson of the American Samoa tragedy belongs entirely to the resilience of the community that was forced to endure it. The island had been tested by an act of unprecedented, intimate brutality that threatened to permanently unmoor its foundational values, yet through the traditional ritual of the family apology, the collective support of the grieving children, and the painful adaptation of its laws, the society demonstrated an incredible capacity to absorb the shock without completely losing its identity. The veteran detective, remembered now not just as a tragic victim of a systemic vulnerability, but as a deeply dedicated father, husband, and protector who gave 19 years of faithful service to his people, remains an enduring pillar of the island's history. His sacrifice forced a naive, peaceful territory to grow up, to look directly into the eyes of modern danger, and to fortify itself against the unexpected, ensuring that while the tranquility of the South Pacific may no longer be absolute, the commitment to protecting those who protect the public remains unyielding and forever transformed. The final chapter of this profound territorial narrative does not belong to the cold, concrete infrastructure of the federal penitentiary system where the exiled perpetrator will spend the remainder of his natural life, nor does it belong to the sterile, typewritten pages of amended legislative codes that now authorize the arming of local law enforcement officers. Instead, the true conclusion of this historic tragedy unfolds in the quiet, generational consciousness of the American Samoa community itself, a society that has spent the decade following the final verdict engaged in a deep, spiritual reconstruction of its collective identity. The physical landscape of Fagatogo remains largely unchanged, with the blue waters of the Pacific Ocean continuing to lap gently against the harbor docks and the tropical sun casting long, heavy shadows across the courthouse steps in Malaloa. To a passing outsider, the plaza appears entirely unremarkable, a routine administrative crossroad where civil servants chat in the humid air and citizens go about their daily legal affairs without a visible hint of apprehension. But for the people who call this island home, the space is permanently altered, carrying an invisible, historical resonance that shapes how every single interaction occurs within its perimeter. The memory of the veteran detective is not allowed to fade into the generalized anonymity of public service history. Rather, his name has become synonymous with a profound turning point in the modern history of the territory, a defining moment when an entire culture was forced to consciously weigh the protective comfort of its ancient traditions against the uncompromising, violent realities of a rapidly encroaching outer world. This process of cultural reckoning has manifested most visibly in how the younger generation of American Samoans conceptualizes the ideas of justice, authority, and public safety within their unique societal framework. For decades, the foundational pillars of the island's social structure relied on the absolute, unquestioned moral authority of the family elders, the traditional chiefs, and the communal bonds that naturally discouraged extreme antisocial behavior through the powerful deterrent of collective shame and family responsibility. The tragic reality that an individual from within this very system could consciously choose to entirely discard these sacred tenets, weaponizing a concealed firearm to execute a respected community protector in broad daylight, dismantled the long-held belief that traditional island values were entirely sufficient to maintain absolute peace. In the years following the trial, educational institutions, community forums, and village councils across the territory have increasingly engaged in difficult, nuanced dialogues regarding the necessity of balancing cultural preservation with modern structural security. Young men and women entering the police academy today are trained under a completely different paradigm than the one that governed the detective's 19-year career. They're taught to respect the traditional ways of life, while simultaneously preparing for the tactical complexities of 21st century law enforcement. This evolution represents a painful but necessary maturation for the territory, a collective realization that maintaining a peaceful sanctuary requires not just an idealistic faith in human decency, but a vigilant, robustly equipped defense capable of actively neutralizing the ultimate forms of human malice. Simultaneously, the enduring legacy of the family's profound double tragedy continues to serve as an emotional anchor for the island's ongoing healing process, proving that the true measurement of a community's strength is found in its capacity for collective empathy and deep, intergenerational support. The two children of the fallen lieutenant and his resilient, late wife have grown into adulthood under the continuous, protective gaze of an entire territory that refuses to allow their family's massive sacrifice to be forgotten or diminished by the passage of time. The community's ongoing commitment to ensuring their well-being and honoring their parents' memory has transformed their personal narrative from one of absolute, compounding devastation into a powerful testament to the resilient, loving core of the Samoan culture. Every year, as the anniversary of that fateful July morning quietly approaches, localized memorial ceremonies and quiet moments of reflection across the villages serve to reinforce the unbreakable bonds that tie the citizens to one another and to the memories of those who fell in the line of duty. These gatherings are completely devoid of political rhetoric or sensationalized true crime curiosity. Instead, they are characterized by the traditional songs, prayers, and quiet dignity of a people who understand that true closure is not a final destination reached through a judicial sentence, but a continuous, daily practice of remembering, honoring, and actively upholding the values of the individuals who are lost. On an institutional level, the complete transformation of the High Court's administrative and procedural framework stands as a lasting, technical monument to the severe systemic lessons learned during the grueling 6-year legal ordeal. The structural gridlock that paralyzed the territory during the unprecedented crisis of jury selection forced future generations of judicial professionals, prosecutors, and defense attorneys to completely reevaluate how high-profile criminal cases are managed within a highly interconnected island environment. The memory of trying to select 12 impartial individuals from a pool of nearly 300 deeply informed residents has led to the development of highly specialized, modern legal strategies designed to ensure absolute constitutional fairness without subjecting the local population to years of agonizing, destabilizing delays. Furthermore, the total removal of the death penalty from the territory's active legal calculations has allowed the local justice system to operate with a far greater degree of pragmatic clarity, ensuring that public funds and judicial resources are focused entirely on efficient, decisive accountability rather than the pursuit of impossible, logistically unfeasible punitive outcomes. The High Court of American Samoa today stands not as a vulnerable institution that can be easily broken or manipulated by acts of extreme violence, but as a fortified, deeply experienced center of jurisprudence that has successfully navigated its darkest chapter and emerged with a profoundly reinforced dedication to the rule of law. Ultimately, the true narrative of the historic Fagatogo courthouse assassination is not a story about the dark, calculated malice of a single shooter, nor is it merely a clinical study of the systemic failures of an unarmed police department and an unequipped penal system. It is, in its purest and most enduring form, a grand, sweeping narrative about the enduring power of human community when confronted with an unprecedented existential trauma. The island of American Samoa was subjected to a violent, concentrated shock that threatened to permanently unmoor its foundational trust, bankrupt its legal resources, and tear apart the delicate social fabric that had preserved its tranquility for generations. Yet, through the painful adaptation of its laws, the deliberate fortification of its public safety infrastructure, the quiet rejection of capital retribution, and the overwhelming, multi-decade embrace of a grieving family, the territory proved undeniably that its ancient commitment to mutual respect and communal harmony was far more resilient than any act of transitory destruction. The veteran detective, whose life was so abruptly and mercilessly stolen from him in the prime of his service, lives on not as a symbol of vulnerability, but as an eternal guardian of his people's history, a revered protector whose ultimate sacrifice forced a beautiful, remote paradise to courageously grow, to adapt, and to permanently secure its future while holding fast to the sacred, loving values that define the Samoan way of life. The long-term resonance of the tragedy outside the High Court has ultimately woven itself into the very folklore of American Samoa, serving as a solemn cautionary tale passed down through families to underscore the absolute necessity of peace. In the local communal spaces, where elders gather under the traditional fails to discuss the future of their villages, the story of the veteran detective is frequently invoked not to re-examine the horrific violence of his passing, but to highlight the catastrophic consequences that occur when personal animosity is permitted to override the collective good. The name of the fallen lieutenant has transformed from a mere line in a police ledger into a moral symbol, representing the ultimate cost of a broken social covenant. This narrative preservation ensures that the lesson bought at such a devastating price on that July morning remains an active, living part of the island's cultural conscience, preventing the complacency of the past from ever taking root again. The community has consciously chosen to transmute the raw, destructive energy of the crime into a constructive cultural baseline, using the memory of their shared trauma to reinforce the boundaries of acceptable societal behavior and to actively teach the younger generation the vital importance of conflict resolution and mutual respect. Simultaneously, the physical environment of law enforcement across the territory has undergone a permanent, quiet structural fortification that stands as a silent testament to the structural vulnerabilities exposed by the assassination. The police substations scattered across the islands of Tutuila and Manue, which once operated with an open door, deeply informal atmosphere reflecting the naive trust of a bygone era, now incorporate modern security protocols designed to protect both the officers and the public they serve. Access control measures, secured perimeters, and clear communication networks have been seamlessly integrated into the daily workflow of the department, ensuring that no officer is ever again placed in a position of absolute, unshielded vulnerability while executing their duties. Yet, even as these modern tactical advancements are systematically implemented, the department has made a conscious, deliberate effort to ensure that the physical tools of security do not create an unbridgeable distance between the police and the citizenry. The current generation of leadership continuously emphasizes that the newly acquired firearms and tactical training are meant to serve strictly as a protective shield of last resort, a necessary deterrent to ensure that the core philosophy of community-oriented, respectful island policing can continue to exist without the constant threat of lethal disruption. This delicate balance between modern tactical readiness and traditional cultural empathy has become the defining characteristic of the territory's contemporary approach to governance and public safety. The judicial system, having emerged from the grueling 6-year labyrinth of the capital prosecution, now operates with a heightened awareness of its own administrative limitations and a renewed commitment to transparency. Legal professionals within the territory are now specifically trained to anticipate and mitigate the unique sociological pressures that arise when high-profile crimes occur within a tightly knit, insular population, ensuring that the wheels of justice can turn efficiently without fracturing the social fabric of the community. The exorbitant financial strain that once threatened to bankrupt the local defense fund has prompted more rigorous, structured legislative budgeting for complex criminal cases, establishing permanent contingency frameworks that protect public resources while fully guaranteeing the constitutional rights of every individual who enters the system. The High Court in Fagatogo has transformed its historical trauma into a foundation for a more resilient, highly adaptable legal architecture, proving to the wider world that a small island territory is fully capable of modernizing its institutions without sacrificing its distinct cultural identity. As the years continue to advance, moving the territory further away from the immediate shock of the 2010 massacre, the ultimate meaning of the event has settled into a profound, enduring narrative of collective triumph over an exceptional evil. The shooter, serving out his concurrent life sentences in an anonymous, heavily secured federal facility thousands of miles across the ocean, has been effectively erased from the active consciousness of the island, his destructive intent entirely neutralized by the absolute finality of his exile. In stark contrast, the legacy of the officer he sought to destroy remains a vibrant, deeply respected pillar of the community's shared history, celebrated in quiet memorial services and honored through the ongoing safety of the streets he once patrolled. The tragedy did not succeed in dividing the families of the island, nor did it cause the fundamental values of the Samoan way of life to collapse under the weight of fear and suspicion. Instead, it forced a beautiful, remote paradise to confront its own vulnerabilities, to fortify its institutions, and to emerge as a stronger, more unified society. The story of the Fagatogo courthouse assassination remains an eternal reminder that the preservation of peace requires continuous vigilance, that true justice is measured by the resilience of the community left behind, and that the ultimate memory of a protector will always outshine the fleeting, cowardly malice of an executioner. The continuous evolution of American Samoa's law enforcement culture in the decade following the final sentencing of the shooter has served as a fascinating study in institutional adaptation. For generations, the territory's police department operated on a model that was primarily social and preventative rather than reactive and militaristic, a direct reflection of the low crime rates and the deep cultural cohesion of the islands. When an officer walked into a village, they were often recognized not just by their badge, but by their lineage, their family titles, and their personal history within the community. This intimacy was a powerful tool for maintaining order under normal circumstances, as the threat of social exile or familial shame was often far more effective than the threat of a jail cell. However, the tragic vulnerability of this model became undeniably apparent the moment a single individual decided to entirely detach himself from those traditional restraints. The post-2016 era has therefore been characterized by a meticulous, often painful effort to build a professionalized internal affairs and tactical training apparatus that can operate alongside these traditional structures without completely replacing them. This has required a massive influx of federal grants and training partnerships with mainland agencies, bringing specialized defensive tactics, crisis negotiation protocols, and advanced forensic capabilities to the remote territory for the very first time. The goal of this modernization has not been to transform the island police into an occupying, aggressive force, but rather to ensure that every officer who puts on the uniform is equipped with the physical and psychological tools necessary to read the warning signs of extreme violence and protect themselves and the public from an asymmetrical threat. This institutional shift has also fundamentally changed the nature of public spaces throughout the administrative capital of Fagatogo. The open, highly accessible layout that once characterized the government offices and the judicial plaza has been subtly but permanently altered to incorporate defensive architectural design and modern security infrastructure. While the territory's leadership was deeply resistant to creating an environment of fear or suspicion, the absolute necessity of preventing another daylight ambush outside a court of law overrode the desire for complete, unchecked openness. Today, visitors to the High Court complex pass through structured security checkpoints, and the presence of armed, highly trained judicial marshals provides a continuous, visible deterrent to anyone who might harbor illusions of utilizing violence to settle a legal or personal dispute. These physical changes, while initially jarring to a population accustomed to absolute freedom of movement within their government centers, have gradually been accepted as a necessary concession to the realities of a changing world. The plaza is no longer viewed merely as a passive backdrop for daily administrative transit, but as an actively secured zone where the rule of law is physically protected, ensuring that the institutions of justice can deliberate and hand down decisions without the looming threat of armed coercion or retaliatory execution hanging over their proceedings. Simultaneously, the profound impact of the case on the local legal community has led to a dramatic resurgence of interest in territorial constitutional law among the younger generation of American Samoan scholars. The sprawling 6-year pre-trial gridlock, which exposed the immense logistical and structural gaps between federal mandates and local territorial capabilities, became a seminal case study in the territory's legal history. Young men and women from the islands who pursue legal degrees on the mainland are increasingly returning to the territory with a deep, specialized focus on updating and clarifying the complex, often contradictory web of statutes that govern the unincorporated territory. This intellectual movement has sparked important legislative reviews aimed at systematically modernizing the criminal code, ensuring that the territory never again finds itself paralyzed by outdated laws or unavailable punitive mechanisms during a major judicial crisis. The legacy of the assassinated detective has thus indirectly fueled an era of robust legal self-determination, inspiring a new generation of judges, prosecutors, and public defenders who are completely dedicated to building a resilient, legally sound justice system that can independently handle the most complex and high-profile criminal matters with efficiency, fairness, and absolute transparency. Outside the halls of justice and the offices of law enforcement, the enduring memory of the tragedy continues to exercise a quiet, stabilizing influence over the broader social dynamics of the island's distinct villages. In a culture where family rivalries and land disputes can occasionally simmer beneath the surface for generations, the absolute finality of the disaster outside the High Court has become a powerful psychological checkpoint for community leaders. When localized tensions begin to escalate to a dangerous degree, traditional chiefs and church ministers frequently point to the tragic annihilation of the detective's family as the ultimate, devastating warning of what happens when personal pride and unchecked animosity are allowed to bypass the traditional pathways of mediation and peace. This collective awareness has breathed new life into the traditional practice of the family apology, elevating it from a symbolic cultural performance into a vital, highly functional mechanism for active de-escalation and community healing. The territory has effectively weaponized its shared historical grief to fortify its cultural institutions, ensuring that the dark path chosen by the shooter remains a widely condemned, completely isolated anomaly rather than a precedent for future conflict. The long-term emotional trajectory of the territory's journey through this unprecedented trauma ultimately highlights the extraordinary capacity of a tight-knit society to find meaning and strength in the wake of absolute devastation. The crime committed on that July morning was an explicit attempt to terrorize an entire system, to demonstrate that a single determined individual with a concealed firearm could violently disrupt the orderly administration of justice and strike down its most veteran protectors with total impunity. Yet, looking back across the long horizon of the subsequent decades, it is abundantly clear that the act of violence completely failed to achieve its chaotic objectives. The justice system did not collapse under the weight of the constitutional crisis. Instead, it evolved into a more mature, robust, and philosophically grounded framework. The police force was not intimidated into retreat. Instead, it emerged as a better trained, properly equipped, and systemically protected organization. Most importantly, the community itself did not splinter into factions or succumb to a culture of fear and alienation. Instead, it drew closer together, anchoring its future in the collective preservation of its most sacred values of love, mutual reliance, and absolute respect for human life. The story of the Fagatogo courthouse assassination has thus found its permanent place in the grand tapestry of the South Pacific, not as a narrative of defeat, but as an epic account of institutional endurance and cultural resilience. The veteran detective, who stood his ground unarmed in the face of absolute malice, continues to be revered as a noble symbol of the highest ideals of public service, his memory permanently enshrined in the safety and security of the territory he loved so deeply. The permanent exile of his assassin to the distant mainland served as a definitive, unyielding statement that the peaceful culture of the islands will violently reject and permanently remove anyone who seeks to shatter its communal harmony through acts of calculated cruelty. As the quiet tropical evenings settle over the harbor of Fagatogo and the modern, securely equipped officers begin their evening patrols under the shadow of the mountains, the island stands as a proud, profoundly transformed paradise, fully prepared to meet the challenges of the future, while remaining eternally faithful to the loving, unified spirit that has preserved its people for generations. The final, enduring legacy of this historic territorial case ultimately rests in its profound transformation of the collective memory of American Samoa, serving as an unyielding testament to a society that refused to let an act of unparalleled violence define its future. As the decades continue to roll forward like the steady, rhythmic waves of the Pacific crashing against the shores of Tutuila, the events of July 22, 2010, have been permanently elevated from a shocking local crime headline into a foundational historical marker for the territory. The physical architecture of the administrative capital in Fagatogo, while subtly modified to ensure the modern security of its civil servants and legal institutions, still retains its traditional, proud aesthetic posture, standing as a living monument to a community that successfully integrated necessary structural defense without sacrificing its distinct cultural soul. The temporary High Court Plaza, once the site of absolute chaos, blood, and overwhelming institutional panic, has completely reclaimed its original purpose as a peaceful sanctuary for the orderly administration of the rule of law. It remains a space where justice is deliberated calmly, where citizens gather to resolve their grievances through peaceful dialogue, and where the memory of the fallen lieutenant is continuously honored not through statues of cold stone, but through the active, daily preservation of the very peace he gave his life to protect. This profound, systematic restoration of communal harmony has been mirrored in the long-term professional development of the territory's law enforcement personnel, who now operate with a highly sophisticated understanding of their dual role as tactical protectors and cultural ambassadors. The modern, securely armed police force of American Samoa stands today as a direct organizational evolution of the tragedy, an institution that successfully bypassed its historic vulnerabilities by pairing advanced defensive capabilities with a deep, unwavering commitment to community-oriented policing. The current generation of officers patrols the streets of Fagatogo and the remote villages of the outer islands with the physical means to immediately neutralize an active, lethal threat, yet their primary tool for maintaining order remains the deep, ancestral respect they command as sons and daughters of the soil. This successful synthesis of mainland tactical training and traditional Samoan values has completely redefined the concept of public safety in the region, proving to modern criminologists and legal scholars across the globe that a small, isolated jurisdiction can robustly fortify its security infrastructure without alienating the population or transforming its police force into a detached, militaristic entity. The sacrifice of the veteran detective did not lead to an era of suspicion and fear. Instead, it ushered in a golden age of professional accountability, comprehensive training, and institutional resilience that ensures no officer will ever again be forced to face an armed assailant completely defenseless. On a deeper sociological level, the ultimate resolution of the sprawling legal saga has profoundly reinforced the absolute authority of the traditional Samoan justice system, demonstrating that ancient cultural mechanisms can actively coexist with and complement the complex structures of modern constitutional law. The historical intersection of the formal federal territorial courts and the traditional village councils during the grueling 6-year pre-trial period ultimately highlighted the extraordinary elasticity and strength of the island's ancestral governance models. The wide public acceptance of the final plea agreement and the subsequent permanent exile of the shooter to the mainland United States was achieved not merely through the clinical mechanics of statutory sentencing, but because the community's traditional moral leadership had collectively processed, condemned, and spiritually isolated the crime. This powerful, unified front between the formal High Court and the traditional chiefs has effectively established a permanent, modern legal precedent within the territory, ensuring that future high-profile criminal matters are approached with a holistic strategy that fully respects the cultural values of the population while maintaining absolute fidelity to constitutional rights and efficient judicial administration. The remote island territory has successfully demonstrated that true, meaningful justice is not a rigid, imported concept, but an evolving, organic process that must be continuously cultivated, protected, and defined by the very people it is designed to govern. For the broader global audience that consumes true crime narratives as a form of intellectual curiosity or psychological exploration, the story of the Fagatogo courthouse assassination offers a profound, highly necessary departure from the standard tropes of the genre. While traditional investigative files frequently culminate in a clinical focus on the dark, pathological motivations of the offender or the mechanical minutiae of forensic science, this historic South Pacific narrative belongs entirely to the incredible spirit of the community that survived it. The true centerpiece of the story is not the cold-blooded malice of a shooter wielding a concealed handgun, nor is it the systemic dysfunction of a penal infrastructure unequipped to handle capital punishment. Rather, it is the sweeping, multi-decade account of an isolated island society that looked directly into the dark abyss of modern violence, absorbed a catastrophic emotional shock, and chose to systematically heal itself through love, structural modernization, and collective resilience. The memory of the veteran detective, a man who dedicated 19 years of his life to the daily protection of his peers and whose family was completely consumed by the subsequent legal fallout, remains permanently preserved as a noble, shining beacon of absolute public service and ancestral honor. His legacy continues to actively guide the footsteps of every new officer who swears an oath to protect the territory, his name forever written in the quiet security of the peaceful tropical evenings that settle over the harbors, the villages, and the enduring, unbreakable heart of American Samoa. As this extensive audio investigative journey finally approaches its ultimate destination, we are forced to step back from the high-profile court dockets, the specific legislative texts, and the immediate geopolitical boundaries of American Samoa to look at the broader, universal truths that this singular case leaves behind. Every true crime narrative, if it is to be something more than a mere archive of human cruelty, must eventually offer a mirror to the society that produced it and the audience that consumes it. The tragic assassination of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown outside the High Court in Fagatogo was an event that shook a remote territory to its absolute foundations, but the ripples of that shock carry an enduring philosophical weight that extends far across the Pacific Ocean, reaching into the very heart of how modern civilization conceptualizes the delicate relationship between human nature, structural law, and the preservation of peace. For over a decade, we have watched how a single, calculated act of personal malice could successfully exploit every hidden vulnerability in an idealistic, community-based legal system, triggering a massive, multi-year crisis that tested the financial, logistical, and emotional endurance of an entire population. Yet, the final testament of this historic saga is not found in the absolute destruction wrought by a concealed firearm, but in the slow, meticulous, and profoundly courageous manner in which a tight-knit society systematically gathered up its broken pieces, confronted its internal weaknesses, and chose to rewrite its destiny without losing its essential humanity. The profound transition of American Samoa from an idealistic, entirely unarmed law enforcement paradigm into a modern, tactically secured jurisdiction serves as a stark, universal reminder that the world is an increasingly interconnected and unpredictable space, where absolute isolation can no longer be relied upon as a primary defense against targeted malice. For generations, the territory's peaceful way of life was preserved by a collective, unspoken covenant of mutual respect, a beautiful cultural architecture where the moral authority of the uniform was entirely sufficient to maintain public order. The abrupt, violent collapse of that model on that hot July morning in 2010 was a deeply painful awakening, proving undeniably that even the most cohesive and loving communities are fundamentally vulnerable when confronted by an individual who has consciously chosen to completely sever his ties to the social contract. The subsequent legislative evolution that authorized the arming of ordinary officers was not a surrender to a culture of violence or militarization. Rather, it was a necessary, pragmatic fortification of the state's duty to protect those who protect the public. The modern officers who patrol the villages of Tutuila today carry the heavy responsibility of wielding lethal force as an ultimate shield of last resort, a structural change that stands as an eternal, institutional monument to the supreme sacrifice of the fallen detective, ensuring that no public servant will ever again be sent to stand guard over the institutions of justice entirely defenseless. Simultaneously, the immense financial and logistical crisis triggered by the prosecution's initial pursuit of the death penalty has left an unforgettable imprint on the structural history of remote territorial jurisprudence, offering a highly consequential lesson in the absolute necessity of administrative preparedness. The sprawling, 6-year pre-trial labyrinth exposed the massive, highly embarrassing chasm that can exist between the abstract written statutes of an older era and the actual, modern capacity of a small local government to execute them constitutionally. The expenditure of over $250,000 from a finite public budget to finance a complex, stagnant capital defense serves as a permanent cautionary tale for future legal professionals and legislators, prompting a far greater degree of pragmatic caution and structural self-awareness when navigating the highest stakes of criminal justice. By ultimately removing the impossible hurdle of capital punishment and securing a definitive, unyielding plea agreement that resulted in the permanent exile of the shooter to the mainland federal system, the territory demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for administrative survival. The High Court of American Samoa emerged from this grueling historical trial not as a broken or compromised institution, but as a robust, deeply experienced center of law that successfully fortified its own procedures, protected its public resources, and fully reestablished its absolute authority over the sovereign administration of justice. Beyond the institutional overhauls and the technical mechanics of the law, the true emotional core of this entire investigative journey remains firmly anchored in the quiet, dignified survival of the detective's immediate family line, a domestic unit that bore the absolute brunt of both the initial violence and the agonizing delays of the legal system. The profound tragedy of a devoted mother who fought a losing battle against terminal illness, holding on to her fading life just long enough to maintain the memory of her husband before passing away mere weeks before the final courtroom confession, stands as a devastating monument to the real-world human cost of institutional inertia. The two children who were left to carry the massive, compounding weight of this dual loss did not collapse into despair or alienation. Instead, they became the living symbols of a territory's collective empathy, enveloped by the continuous, protective love of an entire island community that refused to allow their parents' sacrifice to be diminished by the passing of time. Their ongoing resilience is the ultimate, undeniable proof that the true power of a community is measured not by the speed of its legal machinery, but by its capacity to sustain, honor, and structurally protect its most vulnerable members long after the immediate shock of a media tragedy has faded from the global spotlight. Ultimately, the dark, calculated malice of the individual who chose to execute a veteran protector in broad daylight has been completely defeated by the enduring, collective spirit of the people he sought to terrorize. The shooter remains an anonymous, completely neutralized number within the vast, distant landscape of the federal prison system, permanently severed from the land, the culture, and the community he so brutally betrayed. In stark and beautiful contrast, the legacy of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown remains an active, deeply revered, and vibrant force within the daily life of American Samoa, his 19 years of faithful service and his ultimate sacrifice woven permanently into the folklore and the moral architecture of the islands. His memory continues to actively guide the footsteps of every young man and woman who puts on the uniform of the Territorial Police Department, serving as a constant reminder that the defense of peace requires an unwavering commitment to vigilance, professionalism, and absolute respect for human dignity. As the modern, securely equipped patrols move quietly through the humid tropical nights of Fagatogo, looking out over the peaceful harbors and the quiet villages nestled beneath the mountains, they are the living manifestation of a society that successfully protected its future while holding fast to its ancient soul. The historic case of the High Court assassination concludes not as a story of a broken paradise, but as a grand, sweeping epic of cultural endurance, institutional maturity, and the absolute, unyielding triumph of a unified community over the transient forces of destruction.